What would you do if the world took everything from you, and the only thing you could afford was the one thing everyone else had thrown away? For Maud Tillery, a young woman of 20 cast out by her own family, the answer was written in the dust of the Nebraska prairie. She bought a failed, forgotten farm for just $3 silver, an act of defiance that the whole county laughed at. But what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that the true value of that land wasn't in the soil, but buried beneath it. Settle in and stay close as we uncover the story of a dismissed girl, a worthless plot of land, and the secret that would redraw the map of her life forever. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, as we travel back to the harsh and hopeful frontier of 1883. The wagon wheel cut a final, weary groove in the dirt road before halting in front of the Redemption County Land Office. Maud Tillery sat motionless on the buckboard, her hands resting in the lap of her plain calico dress, the fabric worn thin as a prayer. She was a slight figure against the vast, indifferent horizon, her face framed by a severe bonnet that did little to soften the stark lines of her exhaustion. She had traveled for 6 days, leaving behind the green, orderly hills of Ohio for this flat, wind-scoured expanse. She had left behind the only home she had ever known, a place that was no longer hers. The memory was a fresh brand on her mind. Her father, his face a mask of thunderous piety, his finger pointing not at her, but at the door. "You will marry Mr. Abernathy," he had declared, his voice the final word of judgment. "Or you are no daughter of mine." She had looked at the florid, wheezing face of the man twice her age, a man whose wealth was his only virtue, and she had chosen the door. Her father had pressed a small, heavy purse into her hand. "This is your inheritance," he'd said, the words cold as coins. "Do not write. Do not return. You have made your bed." Now, in the pale afternoon light of a strange town, the weight of that purse in her satchel felt less like freedom and more like the anchor on a sinking ship. Redemption, Nebraska, was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place clinging to the edge of an endless sea of grass. Men in worn denim and sweat-stained hats stopped to watch her, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone woman, young and traveling without a husband or father, was an anomaly. A question mark in a land that preferred simple statements. Maud kept her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the land office sign. She had spent the last of her father's money on the train ticket and the short wagon hire, saving only a few dollars. It was not enough for a respectable plot, not enough for a room at the boarding house for more than a week, not enough for anything but a final, desperate gamble. She drew a slow, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant cattle. Her grief was a stone in her chest, but beneath it, a harder, colder thing was beginning to form. It was resolve. It was spite. She would not fail. She would not crawl back to Ohio. She would take the last thing her father had given her and turn it into a life, even if it broke her. With a quiet grace that belied the tremor in her hands, Maud Tillery climbed down from the wagon, her worn boots sinking into the soft dust of her new and unforgiving world. She had nothing left to lose, which, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of power. Maud pushed open the door to the land office, a small bell announcing her arrival with a tired jingle. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of ink. Behind a tall wooden counter piled high with ledgers and maps sat a man whose shoulders sagged with the permanent weight of bureaucratic boredom. His name was Mr. Gable, the county clerk, and he barely looked up from the document he was scratching at with a steel nib pen. "Help you?" he muttered, his voice as dry as the land outside. Maud approached the counter, placing her small, calloused hands on the polished wood. "I'm here to purchase a parcel of land," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He finally lifted his eyes, taking in her simple dress and the youthful resolve in her face. He sighed, a sound that suggested he had seen this particular brand of hopeful desperation 100 times before. "Got a plot in mind?" he asked, already reaching for a large, leather-bound plat book. "Or just looking for whatever's cheapest?" "Whatever is cheapest," Maud confirmed, without a hint of shame. His lips tightened into a semblance of a smile. He flipped through several brittle pages, his finger tracing lines and notations. "Well, you're in luck, miss. We've got one parcel that's about as cheap as dirt gets. In fact, it's mostly bad dirt." He tapped a square on the map, a section marked with a faded name. Taggart. "The old Taggart place. 80 acres more or less. Folks say it's cursed. Taggart went bust trying to farm it. Man after him, same thing. Soil's thin, creek runs dry by June, and it's choked with buffalo grass and thistle. Been on the books for 5 years. No takers." Maud looked at the small, disregarded square on the map. It was remote, pushed to the far edge of the county, an afterthought. "How much?" she asked. Mr. Gable leaned back, enjoying this now. "The county's tired of looking at it. They'll take $3, silver." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even relief, crossed Maud's face. It was a price she could pay. It would leave her with almost nothing, but it would be hers. "I'll take it," she said. The clerk blinked. He had expected her to balk, to ask for something better. "Miss, I feel it's my duty to tell you, you'd be throwing your money away. It's a hard piece of ground. Nothing grows there but disappointment." "I'll take it," Maud repeated, her voice firm. She opened her satchel and retrieved the small purse. With deliberate care, she counted out 3 heavy silver dollars, their rims worn smooth with time. She pushed them across the counter. The sound they made was solid, final. Mr. Gable stared at the coins, then back at her. He shrugged, the performance over. He was just a clerk, after all. He took a fresh deed from a drawer, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and began to write, his pen scratching out her name, Maud Tillery, granting her ownership of the most worthless piece of land in Redemption County. It was a fool's bargain, a purchase made of pride and last resorts. It was the only thing in the world that was truly hers. What secret could a piece of barren land possibly hold? Was this an act of foolish pride, or the first step toward a future no one could imagine? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Because as Maud would soon discover, some boundaries are meant to be redrawn. As Maud stepped out of the land office, deed in hand, the afternoon sun seemed harsher, the stares of the townspeople more pointed. The news of her purchase, it seemed, had already spread. 2 women standing by the mercantile stopped their conversation to whisper behind their hands, their eyes following her with a pity that felt sharper than scorn. A group of men leaning against the livery stable chuckled openly, one of them making a gesture of sowing seed onto barren rock. Maud kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the wagon she had hired, pretending not to hear, not to see. But the heat rising in her cheeks was a testament to her shame. Her act of defiance now felt like a public spectacle of her own foolishness. Just as she was about to climb back onto the buckboard, a large shadow fell over her. "Well, I'll be," a booming voice drawled. "Looks like the Taggart curse has found its next victim." She turned to face a man whose prosperity was as plain as the dirt on her own boots was not. He was broad in the shoulder and in the belly, his face ruddy with sun and satisfaction. This was Silas Croft, a name she'd heard muttered in the land office, the owner of the sprawling ranch that bordered her new property. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on his thick lips. "Heard you paid $3 for that patch of misery," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "I'd have given you 4 just to leave it be. It's an eyesore next to my land." Maud said nothing, her silence a thin shield against his contempt. Her driver, a quiet man named Jebediah, shifted uncomfortably on his seat. Croft took her silence as weakness. "You won't last the winter, girl. That land breaks men tougher than you. When you're ready to starve, you come see me. I might give you $1 for the deed, just to be neighborly." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and turned away, dismissing her as he would a fly. Maud climbed onto the wagon, her body trembling with a cold rage. Jebediah clucked to the horses, eager to be away from the suffocating judgment of the town. As they reached the edge of Redemption, where the last buildings gave way to the open prairie, a figure stepped into the road, holding up a hand. It was an old man, his back bent like a seasoned oak, his face a road map of wrinkles. He carried a gnarled walking stick. Jebediah slowed the horses to a stop. The old farmer, who introduced himself only as Elias, approached the wagon, his gaze not on the driver, but fixed intently on Maud. He looked from her face to the rolled-up deed she clutched in her lap, then out toward the horizon in the direction of her new home. His eyes, pale and watery, seemed to see more than just the grass and sky. After a long, unnerving silence, he spoke, his voice raspy with age. "Some lines ain't drawn in dirt, but in memory," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Best listen to the old ones." He gave a curt nod, tapped his stick once on the ground, and shuffled off the road, disappearing behind a stand of cottonwoods. Maud stared after him, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. The words meant nothing to her, a nonsensical riddle from a strange old man. She dismissed it as the ramblings of age, but the cryptic warning lingered. Another shadow added to the growing twilight of her doubts as the wagon rattled on toward the Taggart place. The journey from Redemption to her property took the better part of 2 hours. The dirt track dwindled from a road to a pair of shallow ruts, then to little more than a suggestion in the tall prairie grass. The landscape grew wilder, lonelier. Jebediah, the wagon driver, had remained mostly silent, a kindness for which Maud was grateful. He was a cousin of a friend from her church back east, the only connection she had in this entire territory, and his quiet presence was a small anchor in the overwhelming vastness. Finally, he pulled the horses to a halt. "This is it," he said, his voice gentle. "The Taggart place." Maud looked, and her heart sank. The clerk's description had been an understatement. It was a portrait of failure. The cabin, if one could call it that, was a sagging gray box of weathered planks, its roof bowed in the middle like a tired old back. The windows were dark, empty eyes. The fields on either side were a tangled mess of thorny weeds and pale, dead grass. A fence, made of splintered posts and rusted wire, limped around the property in a crooked, defeated line. And there, standing by a water trough green with algae and filled with dry leaves, was a creature that seemed the very embodiment of the farm spirit. It was a mule, so thin its ribs stood out in sharp relief against its dusty hide. Its head hung low, and one ear drooped, giving it an expression of profound, permanent dejection. This, apparently, was the last remnant of the previous owner's assets, abandoned along with the land itself. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through Maud's carefully constructed resolve. This was worse than she had imagined. This was not a farm. It was a grave. The wind picked up, whispering through the tall grass with a mournful sound, carrying the chill of the coming evening. Jebediah began unloading her meager possessions. A single trunk containing her clothes and a few books, a crate of basic provisions, and a small box of tools he had insisted she buy. "I can stay and help you for a day or two," he offered, seeing the look on her face. Maud shook her head, the motion stiff. "No, thank you, Jebediah. I need to do this myself." He hesitated, then nodded, understanding her need to face this trial alone. He left her with a canteen of fresh water and a promise to check on her in a month's time. As his wagon disappeared over the rise, the silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind. Maud was utterly alone. She walked slowly toward the cabin, the dead grass crunching under her boots. Inside, it was even more derelict. Dust lay thick on everything, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay and rodent droppings. In one corner was a simple cot with a rotted mattress. In the center, a rusted wood stove. That was all. That evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the ink-black sky, Maud didn't sleep on the cot. She took a blanket and sat on the cabin's sagging porch, her back against the rough wood, watching the stars blaze with a cold, terrifying brilliance. The thin mule, which she had decided to call Gideon, stood silently in the darkness nearby. His occasional heavy sigh, a lonely echo of her own. She felt the full weight of her decision then, a crushing burden of pride and folly. What had she done? The first light of dawn was a merciless thing, revealing every flaw and failure of her new domain. Maud rose, her body stiff from the cold night, and resolved to do the one thing she knew how to do: work. Her first task was to understand the boundaries of her failure. She would walk the perimeter of the 80 acres she now owned. She started at the corner nearest the cabin, following the dilapidated fence line. The wire was rusted through in places, the posts leaning at drunken angles. It was clear no one had tended to this fence in years. She walked for nearly an hour, the sun climbing higher, beating down on her bonneted head. As she came around to the northern edge of her property, the side that abutted Silas Croft's sprawling ranch, she noticed something odd. The fence here was different. The posts were still weathered, but not as deeply as the others. The wire, though showing spots of rust, was tauter, newer. And the line it cut through the land was aggressively straight, unlike the meandering, terrain-following path of the older fence. It sliced off a wide, promising-looking section of land that sloped gently down toward a meandering creek bed, lush with green grass even in the dry season. That fertile bottomland was on Croft's side of the fence. Her side was the higher, rockier ground. It struck her as an unnatural division. Farmers and ranchers typically used natural features like creeks or ridges to mark their boundaries. This fence ignored the creek entirely, running parallel to it about 50 yards up the barren slope. It made her parcel smaller, drier, and more difficult to work. It was then she noticed Gideon. The old mule had been trailing her at a distance, but now he stopped. He stood near a particular section of the new fence, his one good ear pricked forward. He lowered his head and nudged one of the posts with his nose, then took a step back and let out a soft, guttural bray. He pawed at the ground, his gaze fixed on a small cluster of 3 gnarled cottonwood stumps, long dead, that stood just on her side of the wire. Maud walked over to him. "What is it, Gideon?" she murmured, stroking his dusty neck. The mule didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the stumps and the fence post as if they held some profound significance. It was the first time the animal had shown any energy, any interest in his surroundings. Maud looked closely at the ground around the stumps. It was just dirt and weeds, same as everywhere else. She looked at the fence post. It was a solid piece of cedar set deep in the earth. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet the mule's strange insistence, combined with the odd placement of the fence itself, planted a small seed of unease in her mind. It was a detail that didn't fit, a note played in the wrong key. She didn't understand it, but she filed it away, a tiny question mark drawn on the mental map of her new, hostile home. For now there was a roof to patch and a well to clear. The mystery of the fence would have to wait. Days bled into weeks, each one a testament to the sheer force of Maud's will. She worked with a silent, relentless rhythm that became the new language of her life. She rose before the sun, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, and worked until the last light faded from the sky. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, became cracked and calloused, nails permanently rimmed with dirt. She learned the heft of an axe, the bite of a shovel, the satisfying thud of a hammer driving a nail home. She scavenged planks from a collapsed shed to patch the worst of the holes in the cabin roof. She spent 3 back-breaking days clearing the well, hauling up buckets of stagnant water, mud, and rotted leaves until, finally, clean, cold water began to seep in from below. It was a taste more satisfying than any feast she had ever known. Her silent companion in all this was Gideon. The old mule seemed to draw strength from her labor, or perhaps from the regular offerings of fresh water and the patches of stubborn grass she cleared for him. A quiet, unspoken bond formed between them. She would talk to him as she worked, her voice low and steady, recounting her day, her fears, her small triumphs. Gideon would listen, his one good ear swiveling to catch her words, his soft brown eyes watching her with a steady, calming presence. He was her confidant, her witness, her only friend. And every day, their routine contained the same strange ritual. When her work took her near the northern boundary, the fence she shared with Silas Croft, Gideon would invariably stop his grazing. He would walk to the same spot by the 3 cottonwood stumps and stand there, patient and expectant. He would nudge the same cedar post, paw the same patch of dry earth. His insistence was so regular, it became part of the landscape, as predictable as the sunrise. Maud's curiosity, long suppressed by the demands of survival, began to stir again. One afternoon, driven by the mule's quiet persistence, she decided to clear the thick tangle of thistle and buffalo grass that choked the area around the stumps. It was hard, thorny work. The roots were deep and stubborn. As she dug and pulled, she began to notice the soil here was different. It was looser, as if it had been disturbed long ago. Most of the land was packed clay, hard as stone, but here her shovel sank in more easily. She was trying to pry out a particularly large rock embedded near the base of the fence post when it happened. Her shovel blade slid past the rock and struck something buried deeper. It didn't make the dull scrape of metal on stone. It made a low, hollow thunk, a metallic sound. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove, she knelt down. She dug around the spot with her hands, pulling away the loose soil. Her fingers brushed against a hard, straight edge. It was cold, metallic, and flaked with rust. It wasn't a rock. It was the corner of a box. Her heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. With renewed urgency, she grabbed her shovel and began to dig in earnest. The mystery of Gideon's obsession suddenly taking on a thrilling and terrifying weight. The prairie sun beat down on her back as Maud worked, her movements now feverish with anticipation. She dug carefully around the object, her shovel scraping against its sides, revealing more of its shape. It was a tin box, about the size of a small strongbox, its surface almost completely obscured by a thick crust of rust and hardened soil. It was heavy. With a final grunt of effort, she levered it out of the ground and dragged it onto the cleared patch of earth. It had been buried at least 2 feet deep, nestled right against the base of the cedar fence post, as if the post itself were a marker. A small, primitive lock, fused shut by years of corrosion, held it fast. There was no key. For a moment, Maud simply stared at it, her mind racing. Who would bury a box here? And why? The original owner, Taggart, the man after him. Was it treasure, or just some homesteader's forgotten keepsakes? Impatience won out over caution. She took the blade of her shovel and wedged it into the seam of the lid. Bracing her foot against the box, She put all her weight on the handle. The old metal groaned in protest. She pushed harder. With a final wrenching shriek of tearing metal, the lock broke and the lid sprang open an inch. Kneeling, she pried it open with her fingers. The air that escaped smelled of damp earth, oil, and time itself. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like rotted fabric, were two objects, both carefully wrapped in dark, oiled cloth. Her hands trembled as she reached in and lifted the first one. It was heavy, and it made a soft, clinking sound. She carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Her breath caught. Lying in the center of the cloth was a small leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. With fumbling fingers, she loosened the knot and tipped the contents into her palm. Gold coins, not a pirate's treasure, but a homesteader's life savings. Double eagles, mostly, their surfaces still bright. The image of Lady Liberty clear and sharp. She counted 20 of them. $400. It was a staggering sum. More money than her father had given her. More than enough to see her through a dozen winters. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of shock and overwhelming relief. But there was still the second package. She set the coins carefully aside and lifted the other object from the box. It was a long, thin roll, also wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a blob of hard, brown wax. She broke the seal, her heart pounding. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a roll of heavy paper, yellowed with age but still supple. She unrolled it carefully on the ground. It was a map, a hand-drawn survey, meticulously detailed with bearings, distances, and landmarks. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Official Survey of the Taggart Homestead, Redemption County, Nebraska Territory, May 1872. She scanned the drawing, her eyes tracing the boundary lines. And then she saw it, the northern boundary. It wasn't the straight, arbitrary line of Croft's new fence. The map showed the boundary following the natural winding course of the creek itself. And there, clearly marked with a small X and the notation witness trees, was a drawing of 3 cottonwoods. On the map, they stood a good 50 yards inside her property line. The entire fertile creek bottom, the greenest, most valuable land for miles, was supposed to be hers. Silas Croft hadn't just built a new fence, he had moved it. He had stolen nearly half her farm. The cryptic words of the old farmer, Elias, echoed in her mind. Some lines ain't drawn in dirt, but in memory. This map was that memory, buried and waiting. A darkness was gathering on the western horizon, a bruised purple stain spreading across the brilliant blue of the afternoon sky. Maud, still kneeling on the ground, clutching the survey map, had been so absorbed in her discovery that she hadn't noticed the change in the air. The wind, which had been a steady, gentle presence all day, now began to blow in sharp, erratic gusts, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. A prairie storm was coming, and it was coming fast. She quickly rewrapped the gold coins and the map, placed them back in the tin box, and scrambled to her feet. She had to get back to the cabin, secure the animals, and protect her precious proof. But as she turned, she saw something on the faint track that served as a road to her farm. It was a wagon, a small canvas-covered affair, and it was in trouble. One of its rear wheels was canted at a sickening angle, clearly broken. A man was struggling with it, while a woman and 2 small children huddled beside the road, looking frightened and lost. A conflict, sharp and immediate, seized her. Her first instinct was to run, to protect her discovery. The box in her hands represented her future, her vindication. But the sight of the family, so vulnerable against the backdrop of the approaching storm, tugged at something deeper. This was her land now. They were on her land, and they needed help. Pride and fear warred with compassion. She took one last look at the darkening sky, then made her choice. Cradling the box, she ran not toward her cabin, but toward them. As she drew closer, she could see the panic in their eyes. They were immigrants, their English halting and heavily accented. "The wheel, it is broken," the man said. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "We are lost." They were the Schmidt family, he explained, headed for a homestead claim 2 counties over. There's a storm coming, a bad one," Maud said, her voice firm with newfound authority. "You can't stay here. My cabin is just over that rise. We can shelter there." Hope flickered in their faces. Together, they unhitched the family's horse and cow, and Maud led them, along with Gideon, in a hurried procession toward her small, patched-up home. Just as they reached the relative safety of the cabin, another rider appeared, galloping hard against the wind. It was Silas Croft. He reined his horse in, his face a mask of irritation. "Seen any of my stray cattle?" he barked, barely glancing at the frightened family. "Storm spooked a dozen head." "No," Maud said, her voice tight. "We're just trying to get out of the weather." Croft's eyes swept over the Schmidts, the broken wagon in the distance, and Maud's meager cabin. A sneer twisted his lips. "Harboring vagrants now, are we, Miss Tillery? You'll learn this land has no room for charity." Without another word, he spurred his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the growing gloom, leaving them to face the fury of the storm alone. Inside the small cabin, as the first drops of rain began to hammer against the roof, Maud lit a lantern. Its warm glow pushed back the shadows, illuminating the grateful faces of the Schmidt family. In that moment, holding the box that contained her future, she understood. This land wasn't just about lines on a map. It was about what you did within those lines. It was hers to defend, and its people were hers to protect. The storm broke with a violence that seemed to want to tear the world from its foundations. Wind howled like a hungry wolf around the corners of the little cabin, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very planks beneath their feet. Inside, the 5 of them and the 2 small children huddled together, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Mrs. Schmidt wept quietly, while her husband, a man named Carl, stared into the flame with wide, fearful eyes. Maud, however, felt a strange calm settle over her. She had made her choice. She had chosen community over solitude, compassion over self-preservation. She shared what little food she had, hardtack biscuits and dried apples, and gave the children her own blanket on the cot. She spoke to them in a low, soothing voice, her steadiness a rock for them to cling to in the tempest. The tin box, her secret and her strength, sat safely tucked beneath a loose floorboard. When morning finally came, the world was washed clean and glistening. The storm had passed. The air was cool and smelled of rain-soaked earth. The Schmidt family emerged from the cabin, their faces etched with relief and a profound, wordless gratitude. Carl Schmidt gripped Maud's hand, his eyes shining. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We will not forget this." Maud knew she could not delay any longer. She helped Carl temporarily mend his wagon wheel, enough to get it to town. She would travel with them. She retrieved the tin box from its hiding place, its weight a solid reassurance. With Gideon tied to the back of the Schmidt's wagon, she walked beside them on the muddy track back to redemption. This time, when she entered the town, she did not feel like a fool. She felt like a landowner with a purpose. She walked directly to the county land office, the Schmidts waiting for her outside like a silent, supportive guard. Mr. Gable was at his desk, looking even more tired than before. He looked up, surprised to see her again, and so soon. "Miss Tillery, don't tell me you're giving up already," he said, a hint of pity in his tone. "No, Mr. Gable," Maud said, her voice steady. "I'm here to correct a mistake." She placed the tin box on the counter. With deliberate care, she opened it and took out the surveyor's map. She unrolled it across the counter. "This," she said, "is the original government survey for the Taggart homestead." Mr. Gable leaned forward. His professional curiosity piqued. He adjusted his spectacles and studied the map. He saw the date, the surveyor's signature, the official seal. He saw the creek marked as the northern boundary. His brow furrowed. He turned and pulled the heavy plat book from the shelf, flipping to the page showing her property. He laid it open beside her map. The discrepancy was immediate and undeniable. The map in his book, the one the county recognized, showed the straight, clean line of a fence, the line that gave the creek bottom to Silas Croft. "This is a forgery," he murmured, tracing the fraudulent line in the book with his finger. A crude one, at that. Copied from the original, but altered. He looked up at Maud, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning respect. "Where did you find this?" "Buried," Maud said simply. "On my land." The quiet authority in her voice was absolute. Word of the discovery, carried by the Schmidts and the clerk's own stunned pronouncements, spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. Silas Croft was summoned. He swaggered into the office, blustering about his stolen cattle, but his voice died when he saw the two maps laid side by side on the counter. He saw the tin box. He saw the determined face of the young woman he had mocked, and he saw the townspeople gathering outside the office window, their expressions no longer filled with pity for her, but with judgment for him. Faced with the irrefutable proof, his bluster collapsed. He did not shout or protest. He simply paled, his arrogance shrinking away until he seemed a smaller man altogether. He was not thrown in jail. Land disputes were often messy, but his power, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in a single morning. The town had seen the truth. In the months that followed, a quiet transformation took place. The story of Maud Tillery and the Taggart survey became local legend, a tale told in the mercantile and the saloon, a testament to a quiet woman's iron will. The laughter that had once followed her was replaced by nods of respect. People who had once pitied her now sought her out, offering a helping hand or a word of encouragement. Silas Croft, humbled and diminished in the eyes of the community, made no further trouble. Under the watchful eye of Mr. Davies, the county surveyor, and with the legal weight of the original deed, a new fence was erected. It was a sturdy, honest fence, its posts marching along the winding bank of the creek, restoring the stolen land to its rightful owner. The fertile bottomland was hers. The Schmidt family, having filed their own claim on a neighboring plot, became her first true friends and allies on the frontier. Carl helped her plow the rich soil of the creek bottom, and his wife Anna brought over fresh bread and shared seeds for a proper garden. The isolation that had once threatened to swallow Maud whole was replaced by the steady, comforting hum of community. One evening, as autumn began to touch the prairie with strokes of gold and amber, Jebediah came to visit. He stood with Maud on the porch of her now sturdy cabin, looking out at the expanded fields, the healthy crop of late corn, and the contented shape of Gideon the mule grazing by the life-giving water. The setting sun bathed the entire valley in a warm, benevolent light. "You did it, Maud," Jebediah said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "Everyone in Redemption is talking about it. You took the worst piece of land in the county and made it the best." Maud watched the light play on the surface of the creek, the water flowing freely and cleanly through her property. She thought of her father's angry face, of Silas Croft's mocking laughter, of the crushing loneliness of her first night. She had faced it all and had not been broken. She reached out and rested a hand on Gideon's strong neck, the mule nuzzling against her in a familiar gesture of affection. "I didn't buy a farm," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of all she had learned. "I bought a chance to put a line back where it belonged. It was a line between right and wrong, between stolen and earned, between what the world told her she was and what she had chosen to become. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. If you were moved by Maud's determination to reclaim what was rightfully hers, we invite you to leave a like and a comment to share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and earned redemption from the pages of history. We'll see you next time.